If you come from a pop or rock background, or even a jazz background, the chances are that silence doesn't figure very much in your music making, if at all. The most common use of silence is the short pause done for dramatic or humorous effect, playing with our expectations. I'm sure you can all think of some examples. Some of the earliest examples of a witty pause are what became known as stop time, heard in pieces like Scott Joplin's The Ragtime Dance, where an expected beat, most commonly a downbeat, is emitted through a sort of light-hearted musical hiccup. As well as being amusing, this also relates to the dance, because missing that beat almost causes you to move as you anticipate it. There's surely a similar impetus behind other missing beats like the famous one-drop rhythm in reggae. All of these different silences play with our sense of expectation, which is one of the main ways silence can be used in music. Silence that in one way or another your body reacts to, either by drawing breath or by moving in anticipation. Given the saturation of sex as a theme in popular music, it's surprising that the sensuous pause is hard to find. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any examples. A sensuous silence is pretty common in classical music, whether it's the famous enigmatic silence at the start of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, or the lush, overheated pause in Debussy's Prelude à l'après-midi d'un faune. And you'd think that one of the best places to play with expectation would be the beginning and the end of a piece. Most of the pieces I write are for the concert hall environment, where there is an expectation that a piece will begin and end in silence. Silence before a piece starts is for me always one of the most delicious moments, filled with hope and anticipation. In a way, we all become composers at that point. We see the group in front of us, the orchestra or the ensemble, and we imagine what might be about to happen. So that's one silence that is largely lost to popular music, silence as a space for our imagination. It's a similar story at the end of a piece. If you know a piece is going to be followed by silence, there are ways you can play with that expectation or lead the listener back across that border into the real world. But in the era where you're just a swipe away from skipping to the next track, or in short attention span cultures of commercial radio or the club, you can no longer have that expectation that your song will be played to the end. Go to a club and you likely won't even get to a song's third verse before the DJ goes on to the next tune. But if you know your piece is going to be followed by silence, there are two obvious ways you can confront it. One is to fade gradually into it, and the other is to confront it head on. A dramatic silence just before the end can be very exciting. If you're brave, you might even attempt a whole bunch of them, like this astonishing ending from Sibelius's Fifth Symphony. My old teacher George Benjamin wrote a piece called Upon Silence, and he told us how he deliberately saved the harshest, most piercing dissonance for the final notes of the piece, so that we're left more aware of the silence that follows it. One of the ways I still frequently use to cross that border back into silence is what you might call the fade-out. And it's not surprising to learn that in the impatient modern world of popular music, the fade-out has all but vanished in recent years. One of the very few hits to use it recently was Blurred Lines, which was doing it to sound deliberately retro. One of the earliest written-out fade-outs was Neptune from Holst's The Planets, written in 1918. The movement ends with a women's choir who are instructed to sing from an offstage room. Holst instructs the door to the room to be closed very slowly, and he writes in the score, "This bar is to be repeated until the sound is lost in the distance." But my favourite fade-out comes 10 years before that, the end of Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth, where the song disappears into silence to the words of "Everywhere and forever, blue is the horizon, forever, forever." As a collective body of people, the audience, listening to that, it's such a magical experience. Everyone holds their breath. It's communal, but at the same time terribly intimate. I like to think of that final silence as the nearest we get to the divine, and I think as an ending it's had a big impact on me over the years, particularly because perhaps it chimes with my own sense of the divine as being the natural world. In my piece The Consolation of Rain, for example, I wanted to capture a sense of the fact that a loved one who passes away becomes part of the cycle of nature, so they're literally there physically as part of the wind and the rain. And my piece fades out until all is left is an almost inaudible patter of keys. So for music, silence is very often that divine otherness, the divine beyond. Religious and spiritual composers like John Tavener, Arvo Pärt and Olivier Messiaen write music that paradoxically seems to evoke silence, a sort of contemplative space that imitates some of the possibilities a silence can hold. Messiaen's organ piece Le Banquet Céleste emerges from silence and moves with a glacial speed, as if attempting to get as close as humanly possible to the divine silence. As one of the most religious composers, it's surprising that J.S. Bach's relationship with silence is much less interesting than you might imagine. I only managed to find one example, which came from a great website I found called Wikipedia. It's from the St. Matthew Passion, where there's this sudden, surprising silence before the words, "Open up the fiery bottomless pit, O hell." The implication being that the silence itself was Bach's depiction of hell. The only real reason I can think of why Bach didn't play with silence very much in the way that, say, Mahler did, is simply because of the style of the time he lived in, the Baroque era. Music was usually based on dance forms where one rhythm dominated a piece from start to finish, so in this sense he was much closer to the form of modern popular music. But the religious aspect of silence was there in Western music from the very start. In Gregorian chant, which many consider the basis of all Western music, the monks paused in the middle of the verse, a pause known as the media distinctio, and they did so not just to take breath, but to commune with their true audience, the Holy Spirit. So again, silence as contemplation, another aspect that's lost to the modern world. But it's amusing to read that even in the 12th century, people were already arguing about the lengths of those pauses. Some felt that they were too long and distracted from other forms of worship, so the modern impatient world was creeping in already back then. But that relationship between silence and the breath is interesting, because one of the reasons silence can be both powerful but also uncomfortable is silence is intimate. Have a listen to the silence in the music in this video for one rare example of an intimate silence in the pop world. Silence is intimate because it brings us into a greater awareness of our own bodies. John Cage wrote his famous silent piece 4 minutes 33, partly in response to a visit to an anechoic chamber, a chamber in which all the sound is shut out. And yet he didn't hear silence there, he heard the sounds of his own body, the blood rushing through his veins and the high-pitched buzz of his nervous system. So in Cage's worldview, silence became a way to truly listen to the ambience of the world around us, perhaps even the world within us. It's good to be reminded there are different ways we can think about silence. In the West, we tend to think of silence as absence, a sort of embarrassing void that we rush to fill in. But the Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu, in his book Confronting Silence, talks about how silence for him is closer to the Japanese concept of ma, a sort of presence that negative space has, which is sometimes seen in Japanese art. If you start to think of silence as something divine, intimate, sensuous, a place filled with infinite possibilities, then it begins to feel like quite a bold and ambitious step to make any kind of sound whatsoever. And I think it would serve all of us well as musicians to maintain a healthy respect for silence. Thank you very much for watching. If you're enjoying the channel, do please consider joining my patrons over at Patreon, where I do regular extra mini vlogs, post some behind the scenes footage, and just generally get a chance to chat about composing. And if you enjoyed the video, do please like and subscribe and share with your friends, and I'll see you next time.